48 to 82. As a percentage, it was 46% in 1991. It is 6% today. GDP growth is a no-brainer. There are 4 key lessons I learned from studying India's economic reforms. The first lesson is around law. In 2 books on policy, I realized that analyzing economic policies without factoring in the legal provisions and enablers is futile. Equally, designing an economic policy without an understanding of law is incomplete. Laws enacted by parliament or state legislative assemblies are the infrastructure upon which most economic policies ride. But in most books on economic policy making, I find hardly any references to laws, rules, regulations, statutes. Of course, you can initiate reforms without leaning on the law, the Jan Dhan Yojana, for instance. But mostly you will encounter a law, a rule, or a regulation on the way, a GST, an IBC. So when you analyze or construct economic policies, be sure to work with and keep legal implications in mind. The second lesson is to read trends. My examination of economic policy tells me that reforms are largely a work in progress. What begins with one leadership is taken forward or made more efficient by the next. To me, reforms are therefore an evolutionary process. Let's take 2 big reforms, one that delivers social security, the other that enables business efficiency. On the social security side, let us celebrate, all of us celebrate Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's MG Narega that came into force in 2006 as the pinnacle policy of income redistribution or social security. But this reform is a work in progress of an idea that was seeded 5 decades earlier as the Community Development Program of 1952. It was followed by the Food for Work program of 1977. That was rebranded as National Rural Employment Program in 1980. The Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program was launched in 1983, which was widened to Jawahar Rozgar Yojana in 1989. MG Narega, therefore, is the climax of several policy experiments. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has taken it further by using technology to end leakages and to end leakages of rent seeking. On the ease of doing business side, we applaud the goods and services tax that came in force in July 2017. This is perhaps one of the most complex policies impacting businesses and public finances. It's a very complex law. 1 constitutional amendment, 4 union laws, 29 state laws, 1 notification for the union territories. But it took 10 governments under 8 prime ministers and more than 3 decades for it to come to life. The root idea was first floated in 86-87 budget of VP Singh as ModVat. In 2000, it morphed into SenVat. In 2005, we had an attempt at VAT and now GST. It is to the central government's credit that it has not allowed good to become the enemy of perfect. So all those discourses around we should have 1 rate or 3 rates or high rates or low rates, etc., would have made it a perfect law, but it's great that we have moved so far. Perhaps over the next few years, we will rationalize the rates and other administrative issues. The third lesson is giving credit to reformers. As a nation, we haven't given adequate gratitude to 2 prime ministers. First, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, who constructed the roads to reforms. And second, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is driving on the fast lane of these superhighways of reforms. When we speak of 1991, our intellectual instinct is to credit the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, not Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. But had it not been for the leadership of P.V. Narasimha Rao, India wouldn't have seen these reforms. Similarly, when we talk about Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we see him as a political entity rather than an economic reformer. But under Modi, we have seen the maximum number of reforms. The Jan Dhan Yojana of 2014, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. It has been amended 6 times, which shows the agility with which the market reactions are taken into force and reenacted in Parliament. Ayushman Bharat of 2018, Asset Monetization of 2019, Agricultural Reforms of 2020 that were unfortunately repealed. When we celebrate reforms, we must not therefore forget the reformers. This is not a moral argument. It's an economic argument. Incentives. The word economics use and abuse must be applied here. We need to congratulate, we need to power, we need to strengthen the energies of our reformers, whosoever they be, right at the top or several of you sitting in this room. The fourth lesson is around protests. Most reforms will face a backlash. In the era of instant information flows, the backlashes have been and will continue to be instant too. Every reform expands the span of benefits to society, but smaller constituents who derive monetary and political benefits from extant structures will continue to lead these protests. Let's take two big protests around two of India's biggest reforms. One, when industrial reforms began in 1991, and the other, when agriculture reforms were attempted 3 decades later. I have yet to see a greater and more violent protest around any economic policy than those against the three farm laws enacted on 24th and 26th September 2020. The three laws, as all of you in this room know, were enacted to fix a market failure in agriculture by ending the monopsony of APMC, Agriculture Produce Marketing Commodities market. The objective was for small and marginal farmers to get a choice, corporations to facilitate it, and consumers to benefit from lower prices. But large, wealthy, and powerful farmers and intermediaries, supported by the opposition parties, created a violent protest around these laws. Narratives won, small farmers lost. If the protests of 2021 had no economic basis but a huge political patronage, the protests 3 decades earlier against the opening up of the Indian economy to foreign companies in 1993 had some economic arguments but no political support. Led by what is now known as the Bombay Club, a group of large industrialists, that protests failed because of two reasons: no political support and no public sympathy. Indian industry was opening to foreign competition without any warning or lead time to create a level playing field. That is what they wanted. The movement died, individuals lost, industry won. Rahul Bajaj lost, Bajaj Auto won, narratives lost, businesses won. Going forward, in a political atmosphere of extremely polarized political opposition, we are going to see more such protests around any large reform. In the name of poor farmers, poor laborers, poor consumers, poor this and poor that, victimhood will be created and exploited, development policies and projects will be stalled. The success of using violence as a tool to bend the will of the government and the nation is fresh. Unless the government takes a strong stance against it and the judiciary stops its virtue signaling and playing outside the ambit of its constitutional role, violence will continue and will be used with impunity. I now come to the reforms over the past 8 years. Between 2014 and 2022, under the current government, there have been some new reforms and some evolving reforms. Here's a list of evolving reforms. Disinvestment of public sector enterprises that began in 1991, but the current government has accelerated it with difficult sales stake, particularly like Air India, and the looming investment of LIC. I believe MTNL and BSNL also need to be disinvested, but I think the government has different ideas around it. There are more than 1,000 PSUs at the union and the state level that need to be disinvested. Let's see how that goes. Aadhaar, the world's largest identity platform that began in 2006, was turned into law in 2016, and suddenly direct benefit transfers are happening to the beneficiaries and the entitled without any leakages or rent seeking. Under fuel price deregulation, while petrol prices were deregulated in 2010, diesel prices followed in 2014, but both are incomplete. Effectively, the governments continue to manage fuel pricing, this time through state-owned and state-managed oil companies. The PPP policy in infrastructure that was born in this building, not this building, in the Niti Aayog building, under the Planning Commission in 2006, has become a more ambitious 100 lakh crore national infrastructure pipeline in 2021 under Niti Aayog. Free trade agreements that began with Sri Lanka in 1998 and Australia in 2022 are going to expand their span in the years ahead with FTAs with the EU in the offing and with the UK and Canada under hard negotiations. This is also an area where India needs to negotiate beyond economics and trade and enter areas such as visas and terror support. India's most complex economic law that enabled the switch to the goods and services tax was ushered in July 2017. It has converted 17 kinds of taxes, 8 union and 9 state taxes, into a single tax. And here's a list of new reforms initiated by this government. The world's largest financial inclusion scheme, the Jan Dhan Yojana, was launched in 2014. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016 hopes to end the phenomena of rich promoters and poor companies. The time for resolution has fallen from 4.3 years in 2017 against a world average of 2.5 to 1.6 years against a world average of 2.5. This less discussed reform is crucial for doing business. 3. In 2016, a real estate regulator was introduced to the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act. Although the law has been enacted by Parliament, it is executed by states, hence the varying performance. The Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, a health assurance scheme, was introduced in 2018, which provides for a 5 lakh insurance cover for the poorest 100 million households. Labor laws have been streamlined with the amalgamation of 29 union laws into 4 codes, the related rules of which are underway. This is the first step of a much larger reform. I believe simply putting the various laws into 4 codes is not enough. It's only the first step. We need to get inside the labor reforms to fix them. Agricultural laws of 2020 could have been a 1991 moment for the sector. Sadly, they have had to be repealed. Finally, I come to the directions of the next phase of economic reform. There are many tributaries here. I'm only talking about 10. First, India will need to decriminalize most economic offenses. According to our February 22 study, Jailed for Doing Business, there are 26,134 clauses that carry imprisonment clauses for doing business. These need to be rationalized. We are not saying end all of them. We are only saying rationalize them. These need to be rationalized and are likely to be addressed through a bill that is being tabled in the winter session of Parliament. This is based on some tweets from the government. Details are not clear, but if the new law rationalizes these clauses to the extent that we foresee, this will end the Inspector Raj, just as the 1991 policy ended the license permit quota Raj. Second, India will need to manage a deglobalization as the China-Russia decoupling with the West is showing. Geopolitics has infiltrated globalization. There is an ongoing energy disruption which will be most visible in Europe over the next few months. This will impact India too. Likewise, food supply chains have to be rebuilt. For now, India is safe, but we need to ensure that it remains safe. If the decoupling continues, India's raw materials, particularly medicines, will get affected. Third, this is as a corollary and a part of the knowledge society, India will need to manage technology and global platforms more efficiently. Here we need to pay special attention to intrusive technologies from China, most of which have been neutralized. The banning of, well, not banning, the effective exclusion of Huawei and ZTE from India's 5G rollout, for instance. But we also need to heed the damage that can be done and is being done on made in US platforms such as Twitter, YouTube, and Meta. Fourth, narratives will need to be countered. The journey that began with our Foreign Minister S. J. Shankar, these counters need to be thought through and better managed in other areas. Rankings on various subjects, democracy or hunger, for instance. The Western lens needs to be grilled, its biased methodology and convenient weightage is questioned. Staying out was easy earlier, but as a $3 trillion economy going on 5 and then to 10 trillion, we no longer have that luxury. While we do that, we need to create and disseminate data regularly, even if it hurts. That said, the G to G, B to B, and C to C, that is government to government, business to business, and citizen to citizen engagements with India are deepening. So it's only a small sliver of voices that are creating and nurturing anti-India narratives, some of you will need to study narrative economics and help change the direction of these debates. Fifth, India needs the confidence to transition into a fully convertible rupee. As we all know, the rupee was made convertible on the current account in 1994. It is the capital account that sees full convertibility as incomplete. That said, for all practical purposes, this is a reform that has already happened, and anyone can buy an asset abroad for up to $250,000 a year. Now, there is a problem here. India is a net importer, and I think given the new geopolitical changes, I would like to modify this with a little caution, but I think full convertibility is the way forward. Sixth, India needs to help create an alternative system of international payments. Keeping in mind the recent rejection of Russia from the current international payment system, SWIFT, no country, and certainly not India, should be vulnerable to the moods of the West. What India has to its technological credit is UPI. This must now get internationalized. I saw a news report this morning that is talking about it. It can run concurrently till such a risk manifests. Seventh, India needs to strengthen its intellectual property infrastructure. Despite what some ministers say, there are several companies that are forced by their boards to apply for intellectual property protections in Singapore or the US, and now I'm hearing even in Qatar. The Indian institution Controller General of Patent Designs and Trademarks is not considered safe. So despite the fact that most of the groundwork of such properties, such businesses is financed in India and made in India, when it comes to protection, it is protected outside India. This must change. Eighth, energy is India's weak point. All legislative, executive, and judicial efforts must be made to ensure energy security. This is a field that comes under a larger statecraft, and economics alone will not help. The ball lies on the table of Ministry of External Affairs and the PMO. Ninth, the biggest challenges to India's growth and reforms comes neither from China, nor the US, nor the West or the East. It comes from within. Domestic politics will become more abrasive, more violent. It will use every and any tool at hand. India needs a new equilibrium around debate and violence, democracy and anarchy. Co-opting a polarized politics will be a core skill for reformers going forward. The journey from constraints to conviction that my book talks about now needs to move towards consensus, a new deal, a philosophical stance on the direction of reforms. 10th, we have a small window of time to push reforms. By the middle of 2023, India will get ready for elections in 2024. That will be the year of redistributive reforms. Depending on the new alignments, the next flood of big reforms will begin by the middle of 2024. Hence, keeping the current level of politics in mind, in the short term, the next 12 months will be the best time to push difficult reforms. Take a break for a year and return to reforms in 2024. I now conclude, why should you care about all that I have said? Why should it bother you? To the young policymakers under 30, I ask, how many times have you heard your parents talk about product shortages, lines for milk, lack of opportunities? How many of them had to go abroad to seek opportunities? If you're in your 20s, you were born in possibly the best time of independent India. That best time happened because of economic reforms initiated by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao under macroeconomic constraints and followed through by 5 subsequent prime ministers who walked on the reforms road with an increasing confidence. In Narendra Modi, we see a greater conviction to push difficult reforms from agriculture to disinvestment and inclusion to identity. You need to understand that the prosperity you were born to has been hard fought for. Value it, protect it, power it. To the grey or the bald, I bow before you with respect. All of you, in some way or another, have been part of some reform. It is because of you that India is the world's 5th largest economy today and likely to be the world's 3rd largest before the decade is over. Poverty is falling, prosperity rising, wealth creation is slowly gathering the respect that it should have got in 1947. 3 years ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi from the ramparts of Red Fort boldly said we need to respect our wealth creators, we need to respect wealth creation. It's the first time that I heard such a strong comment, and he has been consistently going on. The chains of the past through industrial policies that bound entrepreneurs in 1948, 1956, 1973, 1977, 1980, and 1990 were unshackled in 1991. Since then, along with the leaders, all of you in this room, too, have pushed reforms with a greater conviction. As my book argues, over the past 3 decades, economic reforms have worked, they have delivered. India is the proof that reforms enable us to leave the country in a better place for the next generation, pull millions out of poverty. The journey from constraints to convictions is behind us. Now we need to infuse geopolitics into economic reforms and convert our economic convictions into political consensus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chakarmane. So indeed, it was a very, very comprehensive presentation. And so I'd like to also mention, sir, this when your book on jailed for doing business was released, and then the very next day, CEO at that time, CEO Mr. Amitabh Kant was there. He called me, and immediately we must have a meeting with the Observer Research Foundation and try to find out what exactly this book on jailed for doing business has comes out. After that, you will recall that we had that comprehensive meeting, and I can assure you, a lot of things are being done by the government in this regard. Many meetings are being held, and CEO Niti Aayog is personally also holding a lot of taking a lot of interest in this exercise. Now I request the respected CEO to kindly initiate this panel discussion. I welcome all of you again to the panel.
Thanks very much for a fascinating presentation. Gautam, that was exciting as well. You know, when you gave us the exact time when the paper was laid on the table of the House, that act itself was not, you know, very exciting, but it led to a phenomenal change in a very quiet way. So thank you for laying out that history. And as you said, you went from constraints to conviction. So I'm going to first turn to Subrakant, who is the Senior Vice President of FICCI and the incoming President. So as you heard this very interesting narration of journey of economic reforms in India over the last 30 odd years, how do you, from an industry perspective, how do you see this? What do you think were the highlights, some of the highlights of what Gautam laid out? And how do you see this going forward now? Is it a sectoral perspective? How can you see this aggressive push for reforms being taken forward?
Well, before I start, first of all, let me thank you for this opportunity. I think this in-house lecture series is a wonderful opportunity to talk to a lot of bright minds present in this room. And I think Gautam's done a wonderful job of stitching together the narrative of how reforms have progressed in this country. So, you know, I think one of the great things about being in India today is that it is the land of opportunity. It always was, but we were shackled. But I think the steps taken over the years and especially those which have helped the economy gain or gather momentum in the last 8 years or so has let us let loose a lot of opportunities which I think it is incumbent upon all of us to focus on. Now, if I were to talk about how this can be carried forward and the sectors that we can focus on, I think the first thing which comes to mind, and it has nothing to do with the fact that my background is in manufacturing, is manufacturing itself. Because, while, of course, this government is taking a lot of steps to push manufacturing beyond that 15, 16, 17% of GDP and targeting, let's say, 25% or more. But I think there is a lot that can be done in manufacturing itself, and including the fact that I think we need to graduate in sooner rather than later from just making in India to in fact designing in India. I'm a great proponent of the PLI scheme. It's something which has been very well thought through and targets those areas where there's a lot of import dependency or a lot of unnecessary outflow of foreign exchange. But if we look at electronic goods, for example, or phones and mobiles, I think the real test will be that in a few years from now, are we still just importing components and assembling, or are we designing some of them? And I think the steps in that regard to get, for example, semiconductors to be made in India is a huge step. So that apart, I think from a sectoral point of view, if you look at something like pharma, where again, I think that is one of the areas where we are exposed, given that India is a great player in the generic space in particular, but we are constrained by being reliant on one country or a couple of countries for APIs. So I think these are a couple of areas, and of course, in terms of opportunity, I think renewable energy and green tech, these are tremendous opportunities. I think what is wonderful to see about the Honorable Prime Minister's leadership is that we are now, we are not aspiring anymore to be leaders or to be the next to implement reforms, but actually taking the step ahead and saying that when it comes to critical things like climate change and sustainability. We want to set the targets. We want to take it ahead. And I think again, I led a delegation of FICCI CEOs to DC during the finance minister, coinciding with FM's visit. And one of the points which came across very clearly was that there is a lot of credibility in India, in what India says. When the finance minister herself or the external affairs minister or others say that we will do what is right from our perspective, for our people, for example, in terms of purchasing oil, it's said with conviction, and that I think that has put us in a position where when we lay out certain goals and targets, the first reaction is not to cast it aside and say, will India be able to achieve it, but to say that this is something that the country has set its mind on.
Thanks very much for that perspective. We'll come back to you, and I'm going to come back to Gautam very soon, but want to return to Anita. Gautam also spoke about some social sector reforms. In particular, he referred to Manrega, but wanted your take, not just on what Gautam said, but can you share a little bit about the NEP, Anita, and how you see this as a major reform, and what are some of the innovations and policies which the NEP has brought about, and how is the rollout going?
So, thank you, sir. And Gautamji, I just wanted to congratulate you on a brilliant presentation. I shall certainly read your book. Well, sir, as was implied in Gautamji's presentation and to some extent mentioned, there is a very, very definite connect between social sector reforms and economic reforms. They go hand in hand, and it is non-negotiable, social sector reforms for economic reforms. The national education policy is very unique. In fact, I was hoping that you would mention it, Gautamji, as one of the, not an evolving reform, but a transformatory reform, actually. So the national...
I was focused on economic reforms. So I'm
Yes.
sorry. I know it's very...
So, so the NEP, sir, since everybody is aware of it, I'm not going to talk about it, but I will talk about the uniqueness of it and how it is going to implement and impact upon the future of India. So right now, the Gen Z, the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Alpha, etc., who are with us right now, in 2047, when India achieves 100 years of independence, these are the people who are going to take our economic reforms forward, our manufacturing forward, industry, etc. forward. What the national education policy is trying to do, and what we are trying to do right now, through complete changes in the national curriculum framework, is to change what we teach, how we teach, why we teach, and how we assess and evaluate. What has happened is, sir, that 200, 300 years back, when we acquired this education system, particularly at the advent of the Britishers, this system was built to prepare clerks. It was built with a prison mentality. So we have schools which have boundary walls. We have schools, we have children who have to wear uniforms, and there is finger on the lips. And there is a very, very definite system of pedagogy, which cannot be changed, and it can be only changed at the risk of losing your job. What the NEP is trying to say is that we need curious, questioning, innovative, creative, collaborative minds, and for that, the entire way we teach has to change. The unique system of NEP is the 5+3+3+4, which is actually based on the socio-economic cultural context of India. So the first 5 years, which is preschool to grade 2, the entire pedagogy is play-based, activity-based, and it is based on the local context, the local language, the local strengths that the school can bring to the classroom. Similarly, the 3+3+4, the system is also based on how the brain develops in a child. So it has become a very scientific national education policy. So by grade 2, the child is 8 years old when the maximum brain development takes place in a child. 90% of the brain synapses develop at that time. That is called the foundational stage, and that has been given the first priority in NEP. And therefore, we are focusing on something called the Foundational Literacy and Numeracy Mission in India. So you will be surprised to know, some of you who have seen the NAS results are aware of it, that in 2017, when we started the National Achievement Survey based on learning outcomes for the first time, in grade 3, there was 47% children only who could do numeracy and literacy as per our requirement, which has fallen down to 35 to 37% in 2021 post-pandemic. So we are talking about these children who are going to take the reins of the nation in 2047, who do not even have basic foundational skills. The NEP requires us to focus on foundational skills first, ensure that they achieve it by the age of 9, and then progress to +3, +3, +4. So that is the first thing we are doing for implementation. I will just touch on 2 other things, sir, because I feel that it is important. The second thing is, sir, technology is a reality. It is a disruptor as well as an opportunity. And we in education feel that unless it is integrated in education as and when it evolves and at the level which it evolves. So if today it is AI and IoT, my student has to know it today. He cannot know it tomorrow. So that integration is something which the NEP recommends. And as you may be aware that in 2020, even before the National Education Policy was released, through the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, we launched the EdTech initiative of the country. And I'm glad to tell you that we take out this India report on digital education every year from 2020 onwards. 2 reports are out. The third one is just going to come out. It's a state-wise report. So there, there are certain areas we keep checking where the state has reached. This year, when we were taking out the report, we found that all formats of technology, all methodologies of integrating technology have been integrated in all the states. So in fact, the COVID became an opportunity for us. So this is the second thing I want to mention, that NEP also lays a huge amount of stress on resilience in education, sustainability in education, which is something which we had not seen prior to COVID. And the third thing I want to talk about, sir, is inclusion. Inclusion in NEP has been given a very, very interesting detail. Inclusion is not just about including every child of every gender, every caste, category, Divyang, etc., but it is also about languages. And this we feel is a very path-breaking reform, though it has existed in the RTE Act since 2009. It says you may try and include local languages as medium of instruction. And though it was also mentioned in the passing in the 1986 National Education Policy, but this policy, it integrates it at every level. It talks about integrating in the classroom, pedagogy, textbooks, etc. So I think these 3 things is something which we are taking up. The first national curriculum framework for the foundational stage is already out. It was released about 2 weeks back. The next 3 stages, NCF will be out in January. We are trying to proceed fast. We hope that education sector will change, will transform, will reform in the coming 4 to 5 years.
Thanks very much, Anita, for laying out the sort of the pathway of the NEP and what are some of the significant features. Moving back again, I'm coming back to Gautam. I'm not going to ask you about social sector reforms, but Anita very clearly articulated that. Wanted to get your sense, you said the process was backbreaking and heartbreaking as well. So the whole process of putting this together. And you also said, you spoke about how salaries have increased. But just to let you know, when I started, my salary was 750 rupees. So it was a little less than yours.
So you beat me to that. They can't even buy a coffee with it.
I know, but that was much before your time, so I'm different generation. But wanted to get your sense again. Your title is very, very interesting, from constraint to conviction. And in one situation, it was with our backs against the wall. And this time it was from conviction. So could you talk a little bit about that? And how do you contrast these 2 different sets, this generation of path-breaking reforms over the last 8 years?
Yeah, in terms of constraints, can I just take a moment and expand on what she said? And I'll come to this.
Ma'am, you made a very important point on the languages. And if Niti were to study, and I don't know on what would be the data that you would look at, is that we have 22 scheduled languages in India. Now, what is the language of economic growth? Is it English? Is it Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati? Is it a little bit of some other language? And if that is so, my intuition says that is so. The language of economic growth in India is English, Hindi, Marathi, and maybe Tamil. Then that is the point where inclusion meets economic growth. So I think you raised a very important point through the NEP. If we can leverage what the student knows, what the child knows, what the child inherits in his genes, in her makeup. She's an inheritor of India, and there is a whole cultural rootedness that comes there. If she is unable to articulate it with the confidence that is needed to convert that knowledge into economics, then she is forced by economic parameters to study and do a lower kind of a job or lower skilled job in a language that entitles her to money, to economic growth. So I think this is a very crucial point. That point between languages and economic growth is something that has been bothering me for some time. I'm glad you brought it to here. So there was a lot of constraints. I think I read out all those constraints. But the biggest constraint that P.V. Narasimha Rao faced, in my opinion, was the Congress party itself. In the run-up to the reforms, there were 4 important documents that were brought out. The most powerful documenter, let us say, was by Pranab Mukherjee, who had one foot in the past. And then there was some talking about we need to change. Nobody knew what the change was. The other people were Rakesh Mohan, Jairam Ramesh, and among the documents that I thought was the most forward-looking was Montek Singh Ahluwalia's, the M document it was called then. That reluctance to I lay on the parliament, the table, the new industrial policy, the reluctance with which it happened tells you a lot about what was going on behind. There was no political support. Narasimha Rao had no political support within the party. All he had was a group of smart people in a room putting together and facing this crisis called bankruptcy, the BOP macroeconomic crisis. That crisis had to be faced. There were enough ideas in the ecosystem by then, some of them from the World Bank. People accuse that World Bank has written India's economic reforms. Some say, some very knowledgeable people say that is the case. Others defend, no, it was that was the knowledge system of the time, and all countries were reforming, and therefore it was a give and take of knowledge, and through which these reforms happened. But who was finally defending these policies? Manmohan Singh, not P.V. Narasimha Rao. In front of reporters, in parliament, everywhere, Manmohan Singh became the face of defending these economic reforms. Manmohan Singh went and negotiated with the Bombay Club. Manmohan Singh budget was the one that saw the Sensex shoot up and has never seen a downturn after that, as in over a long-term trend. So I think that political reluctance to hold on to the past while trying to fix a crisis ended up killing the license permit quota Raj, but they had in their hands, and they continue to hold till today, and I hope in this winter session it will get over, the Inspector Raj. So this entire thing about outsourcing regulation to independent regulators, easing the banking norms, reducing the the licensing requirements, etc., are part of those constraints. Narendra Modi and to some extent Vajpayee inherited this road. The road was already built. I think the most difficult reform was to build this road. That economic reforms, the 2 words, are part of our lexicon. We talk about economic reforms with a great positivity. Economic reforms have delivered this, economic reforms have delivered that. There are protests against it also, that it is in the hands of the few, etc., etc. But these are all smaller problems. Economic reforms is here, it's here to stay, and it will continue to solidify. But this, having the industrial policy, the statement on industrial policy in 1991 opened the doors irreversibly. Through that road, then I think Atal Bihari Vajpayee accelerated the reforms, and Narendra Modi has taken it to the next level. I mean, look at the way he is using technology. to deliver the last mile, let us say, direct benefit transfers, or giving, look at financial inclusion. We had 300 million people who have got 470 million people. Which part of the world can you even imagine that in less than 3 years or 4 years, you have such a deep financial inclusion? So I think Narendra Modi is using whatever tools he has, that conviction to change, the conviction to serve, the conviction towards development, the conviction towards prosperity is there. He's just using whatever comes in his way. If it's technology, great. If it's digital, great. If it is financialization, payment system, look at what's happening to Russia. Russia has been cancelled. The US has cancelled Russia. Imagine that happening to India. India is out of SWIFT. And I think we are building those defense mechanisms under Modi today. I think that conviction is now part of a political narrative. It's no longer an economic narrative.
No, I think, as you said, it's become a political narrative. And particularly if you look at the last couple of years again, I think it's moving to another level. I wanted to come to you, Subrakant, again. You spoke of the PLI scheme, which, is already attracting international investment in sunrise industries. And it's scheduled to create more than 60,000 jobs. So how does industry perceive this? Do you see this radically transforming, bringing in investment in critical areas, in strategically important areas? And are there any further steps on this front you see?
So as I mentioned, I'm a great believer in the PLI schemes, because I think what it does is, in fact, I think the Prime Minister referred to it very correctly in a speech of his yesterday, where he said that earlier incentives were doled out to somehow keep manufacturing or industry alive, whereas now the intent is to actually come up with, or rather subsidies were doled out to keep sectors and manufacturing alive, whereas now incentives are meant to create global manufacturing champions. In my own industry, I've seen things like, electricity subsidies, for example, which caused manufacturing to come up in areas which are inherently unviable. So the day you decide to switch off the electricity subsidy, that investment is dead and gone. Whereas I think the very core of PLI is that this is not something which is going to continue permanently, and it is meant to create global manufacturing champions which get an initial boost to get that investment going. So, where I think a couple of areas that we need to focus on, one which I wanted to talk about, and Fiki is doing a fair amount of work on it, is innovation clusters. While we have moved up certainly in terms of patent filings, etc., in the last couple of years, but I don't think anyone in this room would be chary of admitting that that innovation is an area that we need to focus on very, very strongly, because like I said, again, if we are to move from simply make in India to design in India, to conceive in India and design that and build a world-class product, it can't be done without innovation, without R&D. And that can happen only with a mindset change. It's not going to be 150% depreciation, which gets companies to invest in R&D. That has to be that realization that if we are to move on to becoming the second largest economy in the world someday, then that can only happen with proper investment in R&D, and to get out of the jugaad mindset. I think that's, there's way too much, fondness attached to jugaad. I think we need to go beyond that into proper planned R&D. That apart, I think something which is very important is to implement the national logistics policy. There's a lot of talk which is there about EODB, ease of doing business. But what I'm particularly, happy about is now the focus on the cost of doing business. And logistics, as we all know, is one of the bugbears. And hopefully in the next several years, with the national logistics policy getting implemented properly, that will come down and be a force multiplier which adds to India's competitiveness, both locally as well as globally. We have the benefit of a large unified domestic market, but I think we need to now take that, capitalize on that in terms of the national logistics policy. That apart, I think, again, this is something that when I sit down and think about what is it I would like to focus on for the year ahead in terms of FICCI's priorities. While there is a certain continuity in what we do, but everybody I think brings his or her own ideas. I think whether it is from FICCI's perspective or the Government of India's perspective, a lot of focus on handholding MSMEs. That is happening, but it needs to continue happening, because if you look at the big challenges of our times, whether it is decarbonization or renewable energy, etc., the large companies, the big boys, either know what needs to be done or have the ability to go out and get that knowledge from consultants and the like. But in as much as the MSME sectors are concerned, I think they will need, this is something that will need, they will need handholding, both in terms of ideation, both in terms of how to implement, how to manage this transition. And without, MSMEs, of course, form the core foundation of manufacturing and anything else you look at. And without them being part of the journey, I think India's journey, whether it is on decarbonization or sustainability, will be hampered. That apart, I just wanted to add one more point about labor reforms. I think Gautam referred to it in his opening remarks, or rather presentation, I should say. I think the hard work has been done in terms of codifying it into 4 different codes. This is something, and I think when he talked about controlling narratives, for far too long we have looked at labor reforms as hire and fire. It's simply something which is so important is distilled down into 3 words: hire and fire. That's obviously not what labor reforms is. So that is something which will again add to competitiveness. One final point, I just wanted to touch upon something that you referred to, which is India will have to manage deglobalization. I think that's absolutely that's a correct point, because countries everywhere are putting up economic defenses, becoming more and more insular, looking at their own interests, which of course they're entitled to. If we are, then so are others. But having said that, one of the, again, on the DC trip and elsewhere, one of the things which comes across very, very clearly is that China +1 is back on the table. But we have to work a little harder, because we have missed the manufacturing bus once. And 15 years or 20 years ago, China +1 meant India. Today, it can mean India, it can mean Mexico, it can mean Vietnam, it can mean Bangladesh, depending upon the sectors, depending upon the free trade agreements, etc. So, but I think India is still the natural choice, given the whole host of advantages, the unified market, etc. But while we look at deglobalization on the one hand, I think China +1 is back on the table. And a lot of companies are looking at moving supply chains, which is something that they should have, I think a whole lot of countries and companies were lulled into a sense of complacency that China is the factory to the world. So that opportunity is at our doorstep again. And I think the one thing that I'm absolutely delighted about is when the Prime Minister says that we missed the bus once, and we will do everything within our means to ensure that we don't miss it again.
In fact, I'm just going to get one quick comment from Anita, and we'll try to open it up to the audience to get all those under 30s to ask you some questions. But we spoke about innovation and technology right through, Anita. So, NITI, the Atal Innovation Mission, which has been doing pioneering work in schools and elsewhere and startups. So how do you see this getting scaled up in the education system, the ATLs in particular, and any thoughts on that?
In fact, sir, this is also something which is very crucial for the implementation of the NEP. NEP actually lays down a format for skill-based education, sir. And there is a 2 paragraphs which I love to quote from NEP, 4.23, which lays down 18 kinds of skills that every child from preschool to grade 12 must possess. And paragraph 9.1.4, which says that at every stage, when we prepare a framework, curriculum framework, further skills should be identified for a 4-year-old, for a 5-year-old, for a 17-year-old, for an 18-year-old, and we should ensure that it is integrated across in the curriculum. So that said, sir, I also want to mention that we have recently announced our school innovation policy. And the Central Board of Secondary Education has in fact started training school innovation ambassadors in the form of teachers. We have introduced design thinking as a course in schools from grade 8 in CBSE. We were the first country in the world to introduce artificial intelligence in grade 8 as a subject in the Central Board of Secondary Education in 2019. Given this background, the idea and the objective is that the innovation clusters that Shubhrakantji was talking about, that in the coming 4 to 5 years, maximum in a decade, schools become an active part of those innovation clusters. So we are moving towards that. And the Atal Innovation Center and the Atal Tinkering Labs are actually a huge contributory factor to it. The thousands of schools which have these ATL labs, many of these schools have nothing else. They don't have an ICT lab, they don't have a science lab, they have nothing else, but they have these devoted teachers, curious children, and a very good ecosystem because of which this ATL is actually bringing in a lot of changes in the classroom also, not just in the laboratory where the children are learning, but also in the way the classroom transactions are happening, because the possibilities are now very huge and teachers can see it. So ATL is a very transformatory reform, I would say. And we look forward to the skill-based education actually being implemented in India from 23-24, from this academic session, for the first stage, and for the next 3 stages from 24-25. That is definite. I mean, I'm telling you the inside story.
That's fascinating. What we'll do now is, I think, Gautam, your next book, the pace of reforms is so fast now. You spoke of national logistics policy. You're getting out of date with your book. So you'll have to write another book to catch up. But let's open it up now. I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to put questions. And, while normally some of our most senior colleagues would like to, I'm going to ask someone from the back. Let's get one of the under 30s to put a question to you. So can we get someone to volunteer? And if you can just introduce yourself and put your question briefly, and we'll take a couple of questions, and then once we finish that round, we'll request our vice chairman to deliver.
So I'm not exactly under 30. I'm just beyond it. My friend just told me you can't. Actually, so please pardon my ignorance. I mean, I come from a science background, and like the a lot of the details that you mentioned were new for me, to be able to understand and comprehend. And my question is actually on a basic level, as a Niti Aayog, that we have been working on different aspects of the Niti verticals that we have, and the innovation part, and then also the DMO part. The reforms part that you touched upon, and in your presentation you talked about the rules and the law and the regulation, and then there's the policy, right? I'm just trying to understand how, as a Niti, like we have these departments and verticals, how is it that we work towards these reforms? Like, what is the process that I don't know, in past it was different, but how do you envision that, these, because generally I see that there's a policy and papers that we write towards, but how does it get transformed into a reform is, if you can briefly touch upon it. And of course, see yourself from your execution level
One
also.
more question. Can we take another one? Yeah.
My question is to Gautam sir. Sir, as you have outlined, we have got a very remarkable reform story. So my question is regarding, sir, in your opinion, what are the existing challenges to further increase the pace of the success of the reforms? So what are the existing challenges to further accelerate the pace of the reforms in the aspect of inclusion? And so the second question is regarding, sir, in our reform story, how we will figure in sustainability aspect. To what extent our reform process was successful to ensure the sustainability? That's all. Thank you.
The first question is easier to answer, so I'll take that first. How to convert policy into reforms is essentially, is that your question? I think first thing is to identify a problem. Dr. V.K. Paul was here a minute ago. Yeah, so Dr. Paul spoke to my colleague, Dr. Samir Saran, a few days ago, and asked a very simple question, which we will now be exploring, that how is it that Indian healthcare professionals go abroad. Patients from across the world come to India to get treated, and yet we don't have FDI in healthcare. I think it's a very tight question. I think this articulating this question itself shows a policy mindset where there is a huge problem, probably a market failure, probably a regulatory failure, probably excess laws. We don't know. We don't have the answer right now. We will be investigating this. So the first thing, sir, is to identify a problem around you. I don't know how Dr. Paul, maybe he's part of the sector, etc. He knows more. But I think identifying the problem is the first step towards articulating a policy. Then the problem gets devised. People like us come, Niti works, you talk to experts at FICCI, you bring out experiences from across the country, put them together and carve out a policy framework within which some answers can be given and say, okay, this is what needs to be done. And then it is beyond people like us. It's no longer in our hands. After that, if it has to be a law, it goes to parliament where politics takes precedence. How do you convert? First, you convert a problem into a policy. Then how do you convert policy into a reform? Which means what are the narratives you need to build to ensure, to sell your policy, so to speak, and I find the word very crude. I apologize for it. But there is no other word. How to sell that policy to a politician who can then articulate it in parliament, bring constituencies around it. I don't think there is a better communicator than Narendra Modi ji. I have not seen somebody who can simplify a very complex set of policies into a single label. Let us say the Jan Dhan Yojana, for instance. So you need to be able to sell, you need to be able to inform the politics, and after that the politics happens, they come out with a policy. The executive policies happen at the executive level, but if it's a large reform, for instance, of the sort of companies, the Inspector Raj or the excessive regulation around companies, then you need a law. So that in my mind is the process. By the way, the statement on industrial policy was just tabled in Parliament. It was just an executive. It's not a law. It's just a policy. It is the 9th industrial policy of our country. And I think also there is a great sophistication happening in the world of policy itself in terms of devising policy. Today, we have far greater data inputs coming and which can speak and which can be converted into political narratives. So using those data, using a problem, using some techniques of policy building, I'm sure people can come up with good ideas. Now, how to increase reforms in inclusion? I think India is doing very well, particularly under the current dispensation. I've already talked about, and I will repeat, the digital inclusions that have happened, the financial inclusion that is happening, the language inclusion we talked about. But I think beyond all this, what we really need, I think these are the future-looking reforms in digital payments, language. India is becoming dulled. India is getting used to entitlements. I think the big reform is to convert entitlements into empowerments and get each person strong enough to be able to hold his or her own and come out with those reforms. Empower that individual rather than an entitled politics. You mentioned, ma'am, that you're doing skilling, etc. Yesterday, some folks had come from Germany to our place, and we were talking how you don't need to, you take a degree track, the university track, and you take the skills track. Nobody can just go and stand up one day and say, I'm a carpenter. You can't do that in Germany. You have to go through a particular course, apprenticeship, etc. You may want to study it closely. But the carpenter earns more than the doctor in terms of the fees per hour or whatever that metric is. The carpenter earns more, the plumber earns more. And I think, and when you look back, if you say that we have a labor surplus, we have a people surplus, etc. What is the quality of that skill? If the plumber has to come 10 times to fix that job versus one who comes just once and you pay him 3 times more, you are still better off. So I think that skilling has to become more focused, and I think it has to be made more aspirational, such that a young person who has no interest in economics, finance, sciences, the STEM and all this engineering stuff, wants to just go about his life or her life, can just get skilled and earn a decent living. Last point on this: until the per capita income and the ability to pay increases, this plumber will continue to earn low wages. This carpenter will continue to earn less wages. So I think it's a multi-pronged inclusion that we now need to see. I'm obsessed with economic growth. But suppose you do want to include it, I think that inclusion has to come alongside economic growth.
But we'll try to make it quick because we are coming to a close, and then we'll request the PC to come in. Quick point by you.
So a quick point which I wanted to add about the first question about the transition, I mean, how to convert reforms into actual policy. I think something I wanted to highlight here was that right through the pandemic, that old saying about never let a good crisis go to waste was something we at FICCI experienced with the government, with interaction at various levels, seeking inputs. So many of the, I mean, some of, I shouldn't say many, but a lot of what you see today, for example, the national single window was a point that FICCI put across, because it's done very effectively at the state levels, and I'm sure at the national level as well, it'll have a great impact. But that willingness to listen to feedback, to absorb feedback, and not necessary that every solution we give or everything we propose is the right thing, but that willingness to listen to feedback and then absorb it, and if there is a sense that it is coming in the way of ease of doing business or ease of living, as the case may be, to respond to that with an appropriate policy measure, I think that is worth appreciating.
Thanks. Anita, you have the last word, then we'll request the VC.
Just 2 points. I just want to add that consultation is a process which helps strengthen policy. And you have the example of National Education Policy, 5 years of consultation. You also have the example of the National Curriculum Framework foundational stage. Again, huge amount of consultation. And the policy was, the framework was released 3 weeks back, and it has almost all states, they have accepted it and they're implementing it. So that was the first point. Consultation is a must. Second point, I want to just mention that we 3 weeks back launched the National Credit Framework. So wherein any child can get credit for any area of interest, whether it is skilling, sports, art, music, at any stage. So the National Credit Framework, a very robust system, has been launched for public consultation up to 30th November. And for all the people here, do go on our website and have a look at it. Wherein from preschool to PhD to skilling to everything, you can keep meandering and acquiring credits and getting your degrees and your certificates. So do have a look at it.
Fascinating. Another reform, Gautam, for you to chalk up. But we'll now request the Honorable Vice Chairman to deliver some summarizing and concluding remarks.
Padam, thanks, and thanks to Gautam, the panelists, and also to those at NITI who work hard to put together an event like this. Firstly, of course, my compliments and thanks to Gautam for writing this book and for being here. I mean, I can only imagine how much work went into each one of these pithy descriptions of reform. And it has to be said, they go back a long way. It's not just the last 8 years. One struggles, in a sense, to come up with such a listing and with these details, and you've done it all for us. But as CEO has said, your work's not done because there are more coming down the road. I think because of the fact that I'm probably the oldest person in the room, I will try and give a bit of background on why, as it were, the pre-91 period happened and lasted as long as it did. I was privileged when I was DG of NCAR to hear a lecture given by an eminent Australian, Ross Garneau, which is still available for those of you who are interested, who talked about the context in which China, Australia, and India, as he put it, three large continental economies, at the end of the Second World War, made the choice of a closed economy. And the argument was that all three of them, in a sense, were colonies, although Australia was a dominion. All of them believed that their internal distributional goals could not be achieved as part of an open economy, that they needed to look inwards, and that as being continental economies, they could be self-sufficient. I think the important point I want to make, there's a second point he makes, actually, which is a point about reform, which is that each of them, China, Australia, and India, then faced the challenge of doing a U-turn under the same political dispensation as had brought in the closed economy. So in the case of Australia, it was the Labour Party. In the case of China, it was the obviously the Communist Party. And in the case of India, it was the Congress Party. So I'm saying this because there was a belief that, as it were, a liberal economy was an unequal economy, and that you, in order to achieve your distributional goals, you had to, in a sense, close down. I'm mentioning this because of two reasons. First, those ideas have not gone away. Indeed, I would argue in some ways they've returned. And secondly, sorry, I've lost the point. It'll come back to me. That the political challenges of doing a U-turn take significant political courage. And I think it's no accident in the case of India that the U-turn took place on the watch of Narasimha Rao, rather than, as it were, somebody who was in the direct Indira Gandhi line. So in any economy, any society, any democracy, we have to think about growth, but we also have to think about distribution. And I think in the work that NITI does, we must always also be thinking about the distributional dimensions of what we propose. I would now talk about leadership, communication, and in a sense, the story of substantially the last 8 years, but I would perhaps go back to Aadhaar, which I guess would have been, about 2011, 2012, something like that. What is maybe even go back to the Y2K, which was 2000. I mean, the big change that has taken place in India between 2000 and 2022 is, as it were, the mastery of scale. I mean, there were lots of independent initiatives that India took, even in the 1990s, when reform got started. But somehow there was a sense that these were all relatively, as it were, isolated and minor. And what you now see with UPI, Jan Dhan accounts, Ayushman Bharat, even the Pradhan Mantri, the ration scheme, the ability to deliver on the scale that China perfected maybe 20 years before us. And so the whole, as it were, process by which India mastered scale, I think is the story of your next book. But the third point is, is the question of the role of leadership, technocracy, bureaucracy, and communication, what you call narrative, in the process of reform. I think the role of leadership is twofold, and I think we see that so clearly in our present Prime Minister. It is to have, obviously, a goal in mind. The second is to, as it were, have diverse sources of information. The third is very much to simplify and communicate where you're going, because it is ultimately a political act. What I've read a little bit of the literature on policy reform, and the way they answer the question that was put about what is the relationship between what Niti does and the final sort of outcome in terms of reform, run something like the following. It's an illusion to think that because we've done the work, or even that, if you like, the civil servants have looked over and designed the schemes, that is why change happens. Change almost always happens when there's a political need or context for it, okay? But the important role of technical work is to make sure that well thought through solutions exist when the political moment arises. So that's really the transmission belt, at least in a democracy, between the work of all of us and people in the civil service and what politicians do. That's all somewhat backward looking. I think to look ahead, I was very intrigued and impressed by the specificity and the boldness of the agenda that Gautam shared with us, particularly his bringing capital account liberalization back on the agenda. Some of you may have seen an article by Arvind Subramaniam, which just in the last couple of days, basically saying that way lies risk and ruination. I would just add to that one point that was made, or 3 points actually. One, which is how much has the world changed because we're trying to do this with decarbonization? How does that make how more difficult does this make this? Second, the issue of, as it were, the role of the states as we go forward. And third, you didn't mention as much as I might have, finding our way in terms of global trade. I think that where we are in trade negotiations, in our interactions with other countries is going to be important because, as it were, the old frameworks no longer apply. So Gautam, thank you very much for stimulating this discussion and for the work that you've done. Thank you again, Anita and Sabarkant for joining us. And I hope all of you will be able to join us for high tea after this. I leave that up to Yogesh.
Respected Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, CEO Niti Aayog, distinguished members, and the panelists, Ms. Anita Karwal, Mr. Gautam Chikramane, Shri Shubhakant Panda, and other officials from the Government of India. I consider it a great privilege to propose a vote of thanks to all the dignitaries who have made it convenient to attend the second lecture of this newly commenced in-house lecture series of Niti Aayog. I must express my sincere thanks to Shri Gautam Chikramane for taking us through India's reforms journey. A big thank you to the distinguished panel for giving us the excellent coverage to the India's reform story. Special thanks to panelists Ms. Sanita Karwal, Secretary School Education, and Shubhakant Panda, Senior Vice President FICCI. The able and dynamic leadership of Honorable Vice Chairman and CEO Niti Aayog has really infused this new energy and drive in the entire event. I'm grateful to the team Niti Aayog to make this event a grand success. And last but not the least, I thank all of you to have spared your valuable time to come here. With these words, I invite all of you for a high tea at Shakuntam Banquet Hall at the ground floor. Thank you.
Expect one.